Good evening, everyone. For those of you that may not have been here before, my name is John Davis, JD. I'm the host of the For the Good of the Game podcast, and this is our episode number 5 in our series of live streams that we're conducting during the pandemic. We're really excited tonight to have two absolutely fantastic guests, and our topic for tonight is concussion awareness and education. To give everybody a little context, I'm going to give a little biographical background on our two guests tonight. Scott Anderson is a health and wellness technology leader, clinical expert based in Silicon Valley. He currently serves as the chief clinical officer for SyncThink, a neurotechnology startup using proprietary eye tracking technology to identify common neurological conditions. In his capacity as the CCO for SyncThink, he works with and advises teach aides with particular focus on their research and application of the technology and education supported by their product, Crash Course. Crash Course is the first evidence-based product to educate young people about the prevention and treatment of concussions. Now, since December 2011, Scott has served as a medical observer and spotter for the NFL in conjunction with their in-game return to play protocol. And last, but certainly not least, as a foundation for lifelong learning and the application of doing what he loves, he served for over 10 years as the director of athletic training and sports medicine for Stanford University. Now, Coach Dick Gould, since his retirement, has served as a full-time volunteer and vice chairman for Teach Aids, focused on concussion education. He retired in 2018 after 50-plus years of coaching men's tennis and serving as the John L. Hines Director of Tennis for Stanford University. He has coached 17 NCAA team championships, which is the third most in NCAA history in any sport. Coach Gould was twice voted the Intercollegiate Tennis Association's Coach of the Decade in the 80s and 90s. In 2016, he was voted the Pac-12 Conference Tennis Coach of the Century. And in 2019, he was inducted into both the Pac-12 Hall of Honor as well as the U.S. Professional Tennis Association's Hall of Fame. So I don't know that I've had two more qualified folks to sit and discuss a little bit about anything regarding things that we can do for athletes and for the good of the game. So Scott, Coach Gould, I'd like to welcome you both to the program tonight. Thanks for being here.
What a pleasure, John. It's a pleasure for both of us.
Yeah. Thanks for having us, John.
How'd you get a tennis guy on board? No concussion in tennis, for crying out loud.
I started to reach back into your bio a little bit. Noted that you told me you had started out back in the day coaching football. So I think there's a good link when you first started out. You had coaching regardless of the sport. I think is a great, whether you look at it as a vocation or calling or profession. But to do it for as long as you did at the level that you did is remarkable, and I applaud your achievement. Even though I know you're a humble guy, Coach. So
started with leather helmet, for crying out loud.
He's a legend. I'm proud to know the legend.
Me too. Me too. Trust me. Coach, what I wanted to do is I want to focus everybody on kind of what we're not going to do. The three of us are not medical doctors, so we are not going to sit here and talk about the specific medical neurology involved with what we believe to be the condition called a concussion. We're going to kind of take the reverse and really educate folks a little bit about what we don't know, what a concussion may not be, and then talk about some of the things that are associated with the condition and some of the things that both Coach has seen and what they're doing at Teach Aids and what Scott does. So, Coach, I want to give the floor to you first and kind of let you talk about the genesis of Teach Aids and what you guys really want to get into with concussion education and awareness.
That's great. Thank you so much, John. Teach Aids started about 10 years ago, actually, and the person that we both serve, Dr. Pia Sorkar, was doing a PhD dissertation, and she chose in her global health area, the area of HIV education. And she didn't know much about HIV or AIDS at the time, but it was really a big topic. And she learned about it, immersed herself in it, and actually effectively started that HIV education in 82 countries throughout the world. And they were pretty well established and doing well, and she was looking for something else to get into. And so she she investigated 3 areas, actually. One was cybersecurity, but her husband is an expert in that area, a worldwide expert, so that was a conflict of interest. Another was sexual harassment. That was just before the Me Too movement, so it wasn't quite at the tip of the iceberg yet. And the third was concussion. And as with HIV education, she knew nothing about athletics. And so she had to, about her subject matter. So she had to learn about athletics. And I met her at a graduate school education kickoff for a 100th anniversary celebration. And she told me, she said, "Oh, you're a coach. Do you know any coaches?" "Oh, I know a few." And she said, "Well, can you introduce me to any, like a football coach?" And so Scotty's laughing because she's about 5 foot tall on her toes. And I'm looking at her, "What's this about?" And so she started to tell me. And first thing you know, instead of me taking her down to the athletic department to meet the football coach, the great David Shaw, and some of the other staff members in sports that are really prone to concussions more than tennis, I became enamored with it. It was right at the time I was leaving Stanford after 52 years. And on the first Friday in January, by that following Monday, I was in her office and started out just as a place to work, but she wouldn't let me sit there very long. And first of all, first thing I know, I'm working full time. So Teach Age evolved with her concussion subject. It's been about 3 years now. Everything she does is research-based and study-based, everything from what the people in the video, which basically that's the medium we use, every word they say is tested on the subjects, the people that are the learners, and in this case, mostly high school students. And to be sure it resonates with them, she's trying to make it something that's attractive, it's compelling, it's active. And so the first product was crash course football. So we take you onto the football field and you're in the game. You see the game from the eyes of the viewer. So you really get involved in it right away. And the VR version, John, you've had a chance to see, it's pretty, sure. You see the hit, it bowls you over a little bit. So that's where we are now. And there have been 3 really key players in this movement getting going, besides Scott. Scott's been in there since almost day one. But one of the reasons we got in concussion education is that because the chief neurosurgeon of our Children's Lucille Packard Children's Hospital at Stanford, went to P and said, "I have people coming in all the time with concussions, and there's nothing, obviously he knows about concussions, but he says there's nothing really I can give them that's compelling. We need something that will help them leave here and have access to information that's interesting to the pupil, the kids themselves. Can you develop such?" And so that started it out, and a good friend of mine, John Hainline, the chief medical officer of the NCAA, was really instrumental in introducing us to people in the field. And I must say, we worked especially closely with Michael Kruger, the head of education for USA Football, the governing body of youth football, and in turn with Chris Snyder, who's the education director of the U.S. Olympic Committee. And we finished crash course football, and now we're moving into multi-sport education. So it won't be gender specific, and we'll cover almost all sports with that. We're trying to figure out how best to do it now.
Well, I'll tell you what, when we were at the USA Football Conference and I met you and Dr. Sorkar, I was blown away. I had a chance, as you mentioned, to wear the VR headset and watch the crash course demonstration and program. And it was fascinating to me, not only because I had not ever done a VR headset, which was unique. I'm not a gamer by any means, but it was fascinating in terms of the degree to which it caused you to think. And I think that is a fascinating approach to take, not only for students, because it's obviously entertaining to them, it grabs their attention, but for parents as well. And so much of what we know and really what we don't know about concussions is really what tends to hurt folks. I mean, I came from an era where, if you got, they quote, dinged up on the field, you came off and the coach would say, "Hey, follow my finger," and they would look at your eyes and they might ask you to, count to 10, or how many fingers do I have up? And if you could guess within 2, you were good to go. Okay, go back in. And
I wouldn't even ask that when I was coaching. At my age, I'd just say, "Get back in there. Come on."
So I think that what we've broken through, and Scott certainly has seen some of this, I'm sure from what he's done with the NFL, is it's always in football, because it's such a macho, sport. It's always been kind of a sign of weakness to say, oh, no, I can't go back in. And nowadays we're starting to turn that battleship, as it were, and get athletes to say, you know what, coach, I don't, something's not right, and it's not considered a sign of weakness now to be vulnerable. So, Scott, I want to start off with, and we'll kind of bounce back and forth here on a couple of things, but I want to,
Yeah.
when I was doing my initial research, and I looked into, what is a concussion? Normally, you get some kind of descriptive about, it's a change in the neurological patterns and behavior as the result of an event, or a catastrophic hit to the head or something like that, but an event. Interestingly enough, for those that don't know, statistically, falls cause more concussions than anything else in the United States. Contact sports is certainly up there. But so, Scott, if you would, can you kind of go into a little bit, starting out with what a concussion is not, or what we don't know, and we'll kind of back our way into some of the other things.
Sure, happy to help. I think this is really the single most I don't want to say polarizing question, but it's literally the crux of everything that concussion has been rooted in for the last 50 years, and all the things that you described about your own experience, with how the coach evaluated you or determined whether or not it was safe for you to play, is rooted in this single premise that we don't truly know what a concussion actually is. What I'll say is that there are over probably 40 definitions that have attempted to define concussion, primarily based on consensus, from medical professionals. However, when we look at the evidence that give us information about how prevalent specific indicators are that are common under this condition, we really lack a lot of information, a lot of credible evidence-based information to accurately come up with a definition. And so that's really been really at the heart of the matter, is that we don't really know what a concussion actually is. We think we have some ideas, but with respect to what the literature is telling us and how prevalent specific types of indicators are that are specific to a change in brain function, we're still learning, and at the heart of that matter is that really we're at the infancy of learning about the brain in general. We haven't been learning a lot about, or we haven't learned a lot about the brain over a long period of time, and know the brain better than other areas of the body. And so it's still in its infancy, our understanding of how the brain works. And subsequently, concussion falls into that category, along with other neurological conditions where we just don't know enough. And so we are relegated to a wholly subjective process for ensuring whether or not it's safe for somebody to play a sport or not. And we have certainly in the last decade made tremendous progress, and I'm not going to try to argue against that. I think the emphasis on trying to do more to learn more about the natural history of head injury is something that is something that's become a priority in this country. We're dealing with really an epidemic in terms of the frequency of this type of injury in the public, and the awareness of the condition is at an all-time low. It really, for the last up until probably less than 5 years ago, the public knew nothing about this condition. And so we're taking the word of other professionals and people who have treated this condition and using their experience to guide us through this process. And really, that is the result of us not having clear clinical evidence and guidelines to, like we do with other medical conditions, to tell us how this condition should be managed. And subsequently, I'll say that as a result, education falls to the bottom of that list. How do you educate people about something that we don't know anything about? It's very difficult, right? And so you have to leverage the experience of people who encounter the risks that are associated with sports and other activities that are related to higher prevalence of this particular condition happening. And we have to use their experiences to help shape how we will provide them with information that can be the difference between jeopardizing their safety and ensuring it.
One of the things that on my journey of the past 2.5 years in personal development, I've spent a ton of money and time really trying to attend seminars, read books. I've probably read 6 to 8 books on brain health. Dr. Norman Deutsch has a couple of wonderful books out. Dr. David Eagleman has a fascinating book called Incognito: The Secret Lives of the Brain that really helped me understand a lot. And it's funny, in a joking way, I made this comment, and it probably is best not repeated, but I used to say, well, when I was younger, people said, you shouldn't go out when I was in college, and don't go out and drink too much because it kills brain cells and you don't regrow those. Well, the reality is now, with what we know based on neurogenesis and neuroplasticity, we do have regrowth of cells in our brain, and we do in fact have changes within the structure. As the saying goes, the connections that wire together or fire together wire together. And I think it's fascinating with the amount of research. So I want to kind of take a step to the left just a wee bit, and we'll get into some of the other things that we talked about. But going back to Coach Gould, Dick, when you guys set out with Pia talking about when you actually got into the research and looked at the education part of it, what was kind of, at least starting out, what did you hope to address with Crash Course? What was it you were looking to teach parents or athletes?
Right. I think the first thing is that what's out there is basically right as far as we know it today. The CDC has great guidelines, and many organizations are working with brain health, and especially as it relates to concussions. There are a lot of them that do this. Most of the things we looked at were PDFs. And this is what the chief neurosurgeon at the Children's Hospital told us. Someone comes to my office, I give them a PDF, a piece of paper, and say, read this. It'll tell you more about them, about the symptoms, about what maybe to expect, things to watch out for. And that was it. It wasn't very compelling. And if you're trying to change an attitude, to do it with a piece of paper that you have to read or may not read as a requirement for being able to compete, it just didn't seem to quite do it for us. And we thought if we could design something that would be more attractive, more compelling. VR is great because it's wonderful, but the state of Arkansas has adopted it, VR, because they have VR units in every school. But most schools don't, and most people don't have that access. So we have the HD version, which is the same approach. It takes you into the game from the eyes of the viewer, and you see what's happening, and it's a little more compelling than reading something. And you can see it all and get a lesson from it. Our in Crash Course Football, our main that we used Stanford because it was local, and Bryce Love, who was the runner-up for the Heisman Trophy a couple of years ago, as a running back, is our spokesman, our narrator, did an incredible job on this. And I was surprised. He did, and I was surprised his teammates were participating voluntarily in this with him. They were really concerned about this and about this problem. And as I went out to local high schools, and Scott, you've certainly seen this a lot because you work with them so much. Scott's exactly right. The last 4 or 5 years, this has become a hot topic. And every person I talk to in the coaching business, everyone at the high school level and even the college level, was really concerned about this. I think in the high school level, they understand. And all the way up to NFL, frankly, it's threatening the sport. And if kids are held out and don't play a competitive sport like football at a younger age, they don't get involved in it. The high school teams barely have enough people now to field teams, and that's going to affect the college level of play, which will affect the pro level of play. And I think we make a mistake a lot of times. We think of it as a football thing, but it really, bicycling is the largest cause of physical activity other than just falling of concussions. And our first partner, believe it or not, in US Olympic was synchronized swimming, now called synchronized artistic, or USA Artistic. And they go up in these piles and come on down. I think the fourth leading cause of concussions now amongst high school kids is cheerleading, with the pirouettes they do and falling and catching each other, and they don't have trainers at the games. And youth football doesn't have trainers at the games. High school football is pretty good that way. But to make people aware of what it is, we don't understand the brain, as Scott says. We're learning more and more about it and more what different parts of it do. But it's such a complex thing. We understand that if we can teach the kids that it's valuable, that it really, it's something that you don't play with. If you injure your brain, you don't replace it with a new hip or a new shoulder or a surgery or something like that. It's something that you can't replace. And if you don't take care of it the first time, your chances are the second time you have a concussion is going to be worse than the first. And if you wait to tell someone thinking the headache's going to go away, every day you wait makes that progression to recovery seem to take a little bit longer. So there's so many things we don't know, but we do know that it's bad. One of the products we're just coming out with and releasing in about a month is a fly-through of the human brain, taking you actually into the brain. We can't tell you what the brain does per se, but we can tell you that you can leave from watching this video, which is free like every other product we have, that the brain is something to be really taken care of, that it's very complex. There are a lot of factors to it. It's the one thing that we don't feel any pain when we get hit. It doesn't hurt. We don't know. And if you appreciate it and what it can do, what it does for you, then you tend to take better care of it. So as we're trying to get the point across in athletics and during competition, any sport or any activity, help your buddy. Don't be macho about it. Get out of the contest. Have someone look at you right away. Get treated right away. Get to a doctor who understands concussions right away. And people like Scott don't grow on trees. You don't always have a Scott Anderson at your game or in your facility or around the area. But these are the people that can help you diagnose whether or not you've had a concussion and can put you on the road to recovery a lot quicker.
You know, Scott, to jump back into what we were discussing briefly, it's interesting. There have been a number of high-profile, very famous athletes at both the pro and college level that have retired from football due to concussions. Most famously in my life was the reason I wore number 12 in high school and college was Roger Staubach of the Dallas Cowboys. He retired because of concussions earlier than he wanted to. And yet, I recently interviewed Chris Miller, who was quarterback for the Arizona Cardinals, Atlanta Falcons, was the quarterback coach for the Cardinals, and most recently has served as the offensive coordinator for the Houston Roughnecks of the XFL. He was just recently hired as a high school coach again. And he made the comment, he's got a couple of boys that played football. He said, I don't think the game's ever been any safer than it is today, JD. So from the standpoint of what we have in place, not necessarily to diagnose, but to prevent further injury, the word that we talked about before off camera, the word protocol as it gets used and misused, kind of walk us through, is it appropriate to have a definition for a concussion, or is it more misleading to try and define it? And what types of things do you look for when someone is supposedly, quote, concussed?
Yeah, it's a very challenging question to answer. I think what I would say is that really the word prevention just inherently does not go with the word concussion. I know it's thrown around a lot and it's commonly used in kind of, what I would say is, kind of standard marketing tactics in the United States, that things prevent something. There is no way to prevent a concussion from happening. So if you're looking at a helmet, you're looking at a mouth guard, you're looking at some type of protective equipment, really the reality of the situation is a concussion cannot be prevented. And in a sport like football, the risks are inherent. And so I think I would slightly agree with that statement that the game is never been safer, because our understanding of the risk is much better than it ever has been. And subsequently, our response to mitigating some of the risk by putting in systems and protocols that can allow us to more effectively diagnose and therefore treat a suspected concussion have been accomplished. I would agree with that 100%. There is not today something that can prevent a concussion from happening. However, there are mechanisms that help us better treat the concussion that results from increased risk of participation. If you're a football player, you're going to have a much greater risk than any of Dick Gould's athletes at Stanford. If you're a military soldier and you're in the breacher program and you're blowing down doors, you're going to be exposed to much more significant head impacts from blast exposures that can cause the same type of injury than somebody who is, in a different setting in the military, working behind a desk potentially. So we have come to understand and quantify the risk much better over the last probably 20 years, and subsequently the response has been to implement a structure that helps us better identify what a concussion actually potentially is. And I think the culminating event of this really has been the work of some of these professionals that have been on the front lines of this over the last probably 4 or 5 years to get us to a point where this past fall, the first evidence-based guidelines for concussion were published. It's the first time ever that we actually have a clinical recommendation and potentially a new standard of care for how concussion should be managed. And really I would say it's still in its infancy in terms of how clinical folks are responding to it, but it's really the first time where within the first 3 days of a suspected concussion, we have a known understanding of clinical trajectories that have true prevalence tied to them. And so what we are looking for is, and what we understand from literature is that the most common, what we've done is we've created a classification system or phenotyping of concussion, which is common in other conditions. So we're piggybacking on other neurological conditions and other conditions where we've broken them into subcategories essentially and say, based on the prevalence of these dysfunctions tied to concussion, these are the ones that we should be thoroughly evaluating and making sure get resolved before we put somebody back on the field. The challenge in your day is that this is insignificant and not telling us enough information about the person's disposition. And so you can't come to an accurate diagnosis, right? And subsequently, the standard of care for how we've been managing concussions for the last probably 30 or 40 years has been telling people, you have these symptoms, therefore you have a concussion, and you should go into your room in a dark room and do nothing until you feel better. That has been the standard of care for the longest time. Now, with this classification system and this phenotyping and other work that's been done around exertional protocols, we're learning that, one, there is a way to accurately diagnose people with known classifiers of concussion or known phenotypes that are prevalent in concussion and can be addressed with formal rehabilitation, active rehabilitation. And secondarily to that, we also know that rest is not best and is not a proper remedy or treatment strategy for concussion. These people need to be actively rehabilitated, and the sooner that we are able to correctly identify impaired function in any one of these phenotypes, the sooner we can create a logical treatment plan that can allow us to attack the area of deficiency so that it resolves properly and we can prove to the patient that their condition has resolved and that it's safe to return back to the field. That has never been, nobody was doing that up until within the last 10 years probably, maybe less time than that, last 8 years. And so we've really gotten to a point now where we're seeing headache is really common with concussion. So are vestibular problems, so postural instability or feeling dizzy, those can be very common with concussion. Visual problems such as ocular motor deficits, not being able to track moving objects or seeing double in our vision, all common with concussion. Having some type of increased anxiety or depression type of feelings, and not being able to control those feelings after concussion is very common as well. These are all types of subcategories that are prevalent in concussion. Neck whiplash mechanisms and having cervicogenic pain and cervicogenic dysfunction as a result of the neck, which can create the same type of symptoms as concussion, is also something that is recommended to be further evaluated. And finally, looking at cognitive function, which has been the most common way of assessing concussion in the past. Each of these should be identified and clearly and thoroughly evaluated to identify whether or not these are playing a role and these are contributing to the patient's disposition and their symptoms complaint, right? In the past, we just said, oh, you have a bunch of symptoms, you have a concussion, your brain's been injured, it's on fire, go home and sit in a dark room until the fire goes out. Well, we know that that's not true today. We know that this is a functional impairment that has caused the wiring in your brain to make your eyes see double or make you feel disequilibrium when you're interacting with the outside world, or giving you persistent headache when you try to concentrate for a long period of time, or you try to read, or you sit on your computer for a long period of time. These are all things that are manifesting in the form of dysfunctions that can be treated. And so now we are really learning that there is a multidisciplinary approach that's needed to combat concussion, and that many different professionals that have expertise in these areas can deal with these persistent symptoms and these known dysfunctions that occur after concussion. And the sooner we can identify them, I mean, we're doing it now on the sidelines. We can do it on the sidelines today. And so the athlete is now going home either that day or the next morning with a treatment plan, and knowing that they have this type of impaired function, and this is going to be the remedy for that function, and they have a clear understanding of what it is that they need to do in order to get back to their sport. And so it flips the switch completely on the motivation of the athlete, the ability to limit any type of secondary comorbid factors that may delay or slow the prognosis of the patient's recovery. We're not introducing, by sitting them at home and having them do nothing and removing them from their lives, we're not introducing the opportunity for increased anxiety or social isolation from impacting the recovery process. And so we're not making it more complicated for us. When somebody comes to a doctor 10 days after a concussion and still has symptoms, we don't know if their symptoms are still from the head injury, or if it's from all these other things that have happened to them between the time of the injury and the time that they've seen the doctor, because they've been isolated from their regular environment. They've been restricted from doing their homework, from interacting with people socially, from being a part of their sports organization and the social dynamics that come with being part of a team. They've had no interaction or communication with their coaches or their teachers. They've been completely removed from their life. And so we don't know at that point in time, when we've traditionally evaluated people, a week later or 5 days later or whatever it is, what's wrong with them and how to unpack all of these symptoms. And so what we're learning today is the sooner we can get to them, the sooner we can identify the type of dysfunction, the sooner we can rule out all the serious things that could potentially be wrong with them, like a skull fracture or a severe traumatic brain bleed, or we can make that decision that they need that type of monitoring right away and get them, to the emergency room or appropriate help for that. We're being much more specific with our procedures and our way of ruling in and ruling out the prevalent indicators that come with concussion, and therefore people can assume a normal trajectory and can return to sport safely. Now, the one variable I'll suggest that tips over the apple cart, so to speak, is when the player doesn't have this information and makes the decision upon themselves that they either don't recognize that their symptoms at the time of an injury are specific to concussion, or that they feel external pressures that make them disregard these types of symptoms in the course of a game. If I'm playing it's the state championship game and I'm dizzy or I'm vomiting or I'm seeing double and I go out of the game, my natural inclination is to believe that I'm going to be the reason why we lose the game. And exactly. And so what you described earlier, right? Oh, this looks good. Oh, you're fine. Go out there and play because we need you, right? So this becomes the fundamental basis for what what Crash Course and what Teaches is trying to do through their educational products is really reduce or highlight, for in better ways to describe it, highlight the stigma that is attached with not reporting concussion-like symptoms or not reporting some type of dysfunction, because there is fear tied to that decision. And getting them to realize that everybody has to undergo that decision, and the impact on the team based on your reduced performance while playing impaired is what's going to lose the game for them, not by you continuing to play and making poor decisions on their behalf. And so being able to go through a VR-based simulation of you experiencing a concussion, playing in a game, you then become, you have a better understanding of what it is like to go through. You also get exposure to the types of symptoms that you may, and signs that you may experience that are common with this condition. And you can certainly see the outcome of continuing to play in a game and what type of impact that has on not only your individual performance, but the outcome of the game. And you can make all of these decisions without the fear of repercussions that happen when you experience it yourself. And so, again, by doing this, we're allowing people to understand and really demystify what it means to have a concussion, and ultimately how to potentially leverage your teammates or your community to help you make the best informed decision about your own health, because it starts there. And many people will say, to combat that, how does an impaired person know what's right and wrong, and how should they make the decision that's best for them? We're not saying that the medical person that an athlete should diagnose themselves with a concussion and take themselves off the field. What we're saying is that they should raise their hand and say, something's wrong, I'm not exactly sure what, but I shouldn't be out on the field right now. That's the difference. And really, there is what we've learned through this process of developing Crash Course is that there's an extraordinary community of young athletes and other people who have gone through this fear and this problem with not knowing what to do and not knowing who it's going to impact and upset, and they're willing to assume the potential long-term impacts on their brain health as a result of not speaking up. And so, in many situations today, like mental health, like sexual harassment, and other conditions, people are speaking up for the first time about these things. And concussion is we're getting thousands of people to tell their story and really to blow the lid off this whole thing, that your brain health is not worth sacrificing. As Dick said, it's an invisible injury that no one can see, and you will not be subjected to the fear or the consequences that you believe may exist if you raise your hand and say, something's not right, I'm going to hurt the outcome of this contest if I don't do something, and have somebody tell me that I'm okay. And that's really what we're after, is making sure that these young kids know that it's okay to raise their hand and do that, and that the exact content that we are creating in Crash Course was developed by kids who want this message to be heard by their peers. And so it's being not only created by their peer group, it's also being delivered by their peer group or their near peer group. So it's just been an extraordinary experience. And this is, I always say, this is a product that's been created by kids for kids. And that's really the difference, is that it's coming from their perspective. It's telling their peers it's okay to raise your hand and say, my time is up, or I need to come out, and somebody needs to evaluate me further. And there really isn't a product today that does that sufficiently, and does it with the content that is engaging enough to resonate with this generation of athlete.
Let me ask you a quick one. We haven't talked about this, but I've heard a lot of talk about cognitive baseline testing. Is there any evidence out there to show that having any kind of test for your athletes up front at the beginning of a season is of any value from a comparison standpoint after they've suffered some type of injury and they're suspected as concussed?
Yeah, absolutely. I think with the athletic population, that's exactly correct, and something that I believe is the standard of care today. I would say that if you're an athlete, you've had a baseline concussion assessment of some form, and it can be anything from cognitive or neurocognitive assessment to vestibular and balance assessments to visual assessment. There's all types of different kinds of products and tools that are out there today that evaluate this for this. And really what it comes down to is not only is there value in us being able to compare what we consider to be a normal baseline exam taken at rest to a potential injury situation when we're trying to make a decision if there are changes in cognitive function or some of these subtype phenotypes that we're looking at, there have been a negative change in those that justifies us removing them from play. But it also gives us really good information about if there are deficits that predispose them to a heightened risk. So for example, if a football player has a visual deficit in one eye, left side of their left eye, how are they going to protect themselves when someone's coming at them from that position, that direction to try to tackle them? Their reaction is going to be slowed. Their sensory motor timing is going to be off, and they're going to. We have evidence of this now that that athletes that have this problem absorb more impacts over the course of the season because they can't protect themselves. The same thing is true if you have a balance deficit. If you have a balance deficit, how can you avoid certain situations, or how can you maintain your stability in situations that may lead to having you being tackled onto the ground and having your head hit the ground? There's things like that we can identify in the baseline process that allow us to specifically highlight a deficit that may increase the risk of somebody getting a concussion in their sport, and is a deficit that we can clearly address prior to the season starting.
Dick, when you guys, when you ultimately get, you talked about the new product that you've got coming out. It's more across the board, I guess, if I recall correctly. It's not just football specific, but with Crash Course specifically, when you set out in terms of what you hope to accomplish, where do you want to go from where you are now and what you've seen as evidence in terms of its value to raising people's awareness to where it could go? Or is it kind of at the stage now where it just needs to be proliferated so that there's more value to it across a wider berth of athlete and coaching and parents for that matter?
Sure, I think that's a great point. We do know that it's more received. We've done studies that show that we haven't published them yet, but they'll be published soon. That we show it's better received than anything that's out there. That's really important to us. But that doesn't make any difference if the lesson isn't learned. And so when we get enough exposure, enough use, then the next question, of course, will be to see, well, how many people who were concussed actually did take themselves out of the game. Or friends told them to get out of the game, and we need a bigger sample to get there. My guess is the way this thing is being received is that will be able to be proven, and if we do that, then we've been successful. We're not the only ones working on it. There's some great groups out there. Pink Concussions, Mom's Team, Brain Institute America. There are a lot of great groups out there working on concussions, and we're only one of them, and everyone's concerned with them. And I just we're really positioned to do something really significant here, and we won't know for a couple of years how it's worked. I think getting into multi-sport is going to be important. The lessons are the same as they are in Crash Course football for every sport, but each sport is a little bit unique, and it's going to be a challenge to develop a multi-sport, multi-gender rendition that makes you still feel that you're really a part of it and appreciate and gets you hooked on it and want to know what's happening, and it gets you to identify with the lesson itself. So that's our chore right now. One thing we're doing too, it's interesting. We're doing a story wall where people, we have over 500 stories now of high school and youth, high school and college athletes, about 50-50 of each, who have told their concussion story, how they got it, their personal story, what the symptoms were, what was the hardest thing to do to get over them, what was the biggest help to them, if they had it again, would they do anything differently? So what they tell will be able to be heard by other people who are in the same situation. We have a section that parents who have kids concussed have asked they've come forward, so we want a parent section. So we want to know, because we want to know what the parents have dealt with. The Veterans Administration locally has asked us to do a veteran section. So the veterans, when they come back from combat who've been concussed, can learn also from their peers what they went through, to be sure they're not alone. I think this is going to be really, really valuable. Everything we have is free. These will all be linked into Crash Course Football and multi-sport version, the Brain Fly Through, and the Symptom Story Wall. And I think it's going to be a really nice product, a suite of products that people can refer to, and hopefully it will make a difference. That's our goal. I mean, what would this society be without sport? We may find out with COVID right now, unfortunately, but it's a whole different world without sport. And plus the values that sport teach. To see people afraid to play sport because of possible things like concussions and injuries that might have been avoided if they knew a little bit more about them and how to take a little better care of themselves. What a crime it would be to see people stop having the opportunity to learn the values of sport and sport participation because it wasn't safe enough. And it doesn't have to be football; it can be any sport. And it's amazing to me in the U.S. Olympic Committee and Paralympic Committee of their sports how many people have been crying for this multi-sport education. So we're anxious to get that out there. USA Football now is, as you know, John, from their conference, actually just this week, the site's up and is now certifying their youth coaches as well. That can be used by parents and the youth. There's a youth certification as well, and I suspect this will continue to grow. The National Federation of High Schools has a certification system as well. Everybody has one, and hopefully it's one that's engaging, compelling, that people will listen to and react to. Again, I think the times have really changed. I think the time is right now for people to accept this and that it is a problem and to do something about it to make the sport safer.
Yeah, I want to make two comments and then circle back and let Scott talk about something that that we've discussed via email, but not necessarily off camera. And you know, I was at the USA Football conference. Actually, it was a conference USA Football was attending at the Hall of Fame, and we had a course that we went through, and they showed a video, Scott, of what they called at the time second impact syndrome, and it was a young man that had been concussed during a game, was evaluated. This was back probably a decade ago. Was evaluated in a very simple way, for lack of a better description. And was judged to be safe to go back in the game. And in fact, on a subsequent play prior to the game ending, was tackled. His head, he had a whiplash effect of his head hitting the ground really hard on a tackle. And he passed away the next day. In fact, he was actually in the video. You can see him beginning to scream before he was even leaving the field from the trauma that this hit had caused. So I want to not, and it's not said to scare people, but what I wanted to do is that type of thing. Sometimes, you know, the old Scared Straight program on any number of different levels, whether it's in a courtroom to scare future potential criminals, or whether it's in something that requires a tremendous amount of risk and to educate people to that risk ahead of time. Talk a little bit about how the fact that concussion, as it were, as a symptom, as a group of symptoms, can manifest differently in different people, and the degree to which these protocols really have to account for all that. It's not just a single one catch-all type of, oh, I've got a headache, or my head's pounding, or my vision's blurry. Kind of go into that a little bit as far as how there are so many different manifestations based on the individual athlete.
Yeah, I mean, it is an individualized injury. I mean, we refer to that. It's heterogeneous. It requires an individualized approach to the evaluation because there are so many factors that can be involved with respect to the athlete's injury history, their family history, and the different types of prevalent indicators, these subtypes that we are seeing that are common. You when you see a concussion, you don't just see one of them. You may see a cluster of 3 or 4 of them, or maybe all of them, or maybe just one single one. It just depends on so many different factors. And so we have to treat every single concussion or suspected concussion as if their own individualized injury, and develop our own procedure for evaluating that particular injury, and develop our own subsequent individualized recovery protocol for that person. So no two concussions are ever going to be the same. And if we have to have a better understanding, or we have to have a clear understanding of not just the person's prior medical history, but also their family history. If they have a family history of learning disabilities or mood disorders or other conditions, it could potentially cause complications in their recovery. And so, but it can also give us guidance into how they should be managed. And so, we have to, what I refer to and what a lot of people have said is we have to unpack concussion, each individual concussion, and we have to go through, there isn't a specific way to, I would say, to assess every single patient. We have to know what's happened to them, what the potential mechanism is, and what the patient's disposition is, and then dig into specifically all these other variables and factors that potentially could contribute to this, to come to a clear understanding of what systems are involved in the brain, which ones need to be rehabilitated, and what is the plan for how we're going to go about that based on all of these factors that we understand. So, and then with sport, you throw on other things like logistics, right? Like, there is a season and a calendar that we have to account for, because coach wants to know when Johnny's going to be back, and the parents want to know when's Johnny going to be able to go to school. And so we have to factor in, once we make the diagnosis and we establish a treatment plan, we have to start being prescriptive, or we have to, essentially have a plan for when we can expect that these things will start to become part of their normal routine again, right? When can they start to go back to school and academic activities? When can they study for long periods? When can they start taking exams? When can they start driving? When can they return to sport without contact? When can they start to progress into normal activity? When can they play in a game? All of these things are questions that parents and coaches are going to ask us. And so we have to have that information readily available too, once we've unpacked the whole medical side of the situation. And so it becomes a very complex and specific routine that we have to go through for that individual patient. It has to be specific to them, and no two plans are the same. And so, it helps us understand what the risks are if we don't follow that plan, and to make sure that we have the athlete has essentially reached goals in their recovery that tells us that they have met these certain conditions, and therefore we are seeing the progress that we should see, and that this timeline that we've told mom and dad about is on target or not, and subsequently with coach as well, right? The coach wants to know they got the state championship game in 16 days. Is he gonna be able to play in 16 days? We're not going to know the day that the injury occurs if that's possible or not. But based on the prognosis of the recovery, the types of situation of dysfunctions that are involved, our subsequent treatment plan, and the response to that treatment, those are all considerations that will help us understand whether or not if that's a realistic expectation or not. And just every individual is different, so we can't say that up front.
I'd reemphasize this point, John, too, that it's not just a football problem. It's a sport problem in almost all sports. I think that when you say girls soccer, a lot of studies have shown that several studies have shown that girls soccer has more concussions per capita than high school football. And also another thing that's a little bit relevant is not necessarily a spectacular hit. You think of the World Cup when the two gals go up for a header in the finals for the gold, and they hit heads really hard and they just fall splat on the ground on the turf. Obviously, there's a problem there. Or the guy gets tackled, he's lying there in the field, he's slow to get up, and he can't quite walk out field straight without help. That's one thing. But then there are multiple hits that are not those spectacular hits that cause concussions as well. You take a lineman, and the linemen are hit. In the interior linemen are hitting each other every play, and those aren't spectacular. It's not one hit that's going to take you to the ground, but it's a series of hits that accumulate over the period of time. We're finding out more and more that those are really, really debilitating in the long run. So there are things about, as an example, trying to make it more safer. Soccer, they're trying to give you a time, or trying to get it to the point now where internationally you can take a timeout and get a player off the field instead of having to play on. And in youth football, they're looking now at 2-point stances as an example, as being a little negating a little bit the smash mouth at the line that is leading to these multiple hits that are subconcussive that mount up. So there are a lot of things going on right now that are really trying. I think rule changes are young kids aren't heading in soccer anymore. It differs a little bit by gender. Young gals tend to get concussed a little more easily, it seems to be, than generally guys the same age or older gals. The reasons are not quite, they're different hypotheses as to the reasons, but there are differences with people. And there's no one size that fits all, as Scott's saying, in treatment. And so getting the diagnosis early, promptly, and right away is critical, and not being afraid to speak up, because the consequences can be really bad if you don't.
Yeah, I definitely, I've got my own feelings about, I mean, where I live here in Kentucky, and when I was coaching youth football, we had leagues starting tackle football at the age of 6. And while I did start playing tackle football in the 3rd grade when I was fairly young, I think that there are 2 factors that a lot of parents don't consider with the youngest age kids that mitigate the risk a little bit. One, at that age, you don't have the type of physical violence that you do with, high school and above level kids. And 2, you also tend to have much less head-to-head contact because of the lack of, I mean, every once in a while you'll see a kid that's very aggressive, but for the most part, most kids are timid at that age. Now, I do believe, I don't think kids should be introduced to tackle football until probably at least 10, maybe even 13. And I think that the way that USA Football has remodeled the football development model based on the long-term athletic development theories that have existed for a long time, is that you can learn the game by learning flag and greatly reduce many of those risks, and then get into limited contact as you begin to develop your technique and learn more about the game, and before it becomes a physical risk. And then ultimately, when you are ready, I mean, I can't tell you the number of professional athletes that I've interviewed that, I mean, Ted Cottrell, we had him on a couple of weeks ago. He didn't play football until he was in high school. And I've run it, and Dominican Sue was a soccer player until he got into high school. So, I mean, there's all kinds of folks that have been out there that have experienced sport and gotten into contact sports, be they whatever, whether it's individual martial arts or wrestling or football or whatever, and experienced things and have had the initial front end of their athletic experience, have had that risk mitigated just by how they got into the sport. So I guess is what I was trying to get at. Scott, I wanted to give you a kind of because we're closing in on an hour here. I wanted to kind of give you the floor real quick before we talk about organizations and education, to kind of wrap up and say, if when you talk about from a clinical standpoint, obviously I would think that the best advice, and I operate under the mantra that common sense isn't always common. The best thing to do is, when in doubt, get them out. I mean, if you have any doubt in your mind that a kid may have suffered some type of concussion activity, or be concussed, get them out. But what do you say? Because obviously, youth football and certainly most high schools are not going to have the plethora of either medical or device-oriented scientific evidence-based things that they can use like you can on the sidelines in an NFL game and even at some college level. So to those folks at the lower levels, what do you say in terms of just considerations and recommendations when any athlete may be considered concussed?
Yeah, I think a couple things. One, I would say, this is not a sport issue. And what I mean by that is, it's not a disruption in their athletic career. It's a disruption to their entire life. And so when you think about whether or not an athlete may have sustained a concussion or not, think about all the things that are outside of their sport that potentially they're going to have trouble with as a result. If you're a sophomore or a junior in high school and you're preparing to take the SAT, good luck with that if your child has a concussion. So the key, I would tell parents, think about all the things that are not sport related that are going to be problematic for your child if your child continues to pursue sports post concussion. The second thing, so that typically motivates people to think about getting them, one, removing them from play, but also two, getting them prompt care. The second thing I would say is your emergency room and your pediatrician are not going to properly diagnose your child. You need to see a neurological specialist. So that means a neurologist, a neurosurgeon, a concussion specialist, somebody who is trained in assessing concussion and coming up with an accurate diagnosis by means other than just the patient's reporting of symptoms. So gone are the days where the pediatrician is, I believe, the best position to make that diagnosis. Do not settle for that. You need to see somebody who specializes in the brain and can give you specific guidance on an appropriate treatment plan, and also make referrals to other neurospecialists that coincide with the types of dysfunctions that are common in concussion that we reviewed earlier. And so, for example, if you have a vision problem, if you see a neurologist and they recognize that you're seeing double, guess what? You're going to go to a neurooptometrist. If you're having a balance issue, you're going to go to a physical therapist who specializes in vestibular disorders. If you're having persistent headaches after concussion, you're going to see a neurologist. If you're having behavioral issues or mood disorder like symptoms or clinical presentation, you're going to see a psychologist. There is an extensive network of professionals who deal with these phenotypes of concussions that can, the sooner you get your child to them, can help you resolve this condition and can get your son or daughter back to a normal way of life. And the longer you wait for that to happen, and the longer you take someone else's advice, the more likely it is that you're going to get faulty information, which is not only going to put your child at risk for going back to sport too soon, but it's also going to have ramifications for their academic performance, because you're going to believe that just because my son feels better and their symptoms are gone, they must be recovered. That is not the case. There was a paper that came out just last month, I believe, that said the majority of concussion patients, especially athletes, are not fully recovered after 14 days. So think about with this prior logic that said that 90% of concussions resolve within 7 to 10 days transiently on their own. You didn't need to do anything. What we're realizing is that symptoms are manifesting because people aren't getting the proper care. And when they are getting the proper care, they're taking longer to recover because they have multiple deficits that need to be managed. And so I think we have to be honest with ourselves about this is a serious condition, despite the fact that we can't see it, feel it, touch it, or watch it improve over time. We have to treat it seriously, and we have to understand the ramifications of our decisions. And we should, I think, put ourselves in position to get the best and most scientifically credible information. That's what I would do for my kids.
Thanks, Scott. I wrote some notes because one thing I want to talk about, and then I'll transition into a little short discussion with Dick in terms of both TeachAge and the other organizations that are out there, is that we will, because this is a live stream, when we publish the replay, I will go in and add to the show notes some of the things that we've talked about, specific references, as well as website locations and a list of resources that are available to everyone out there, in addition to what has been done with TeachAids. And so, Dick, what I wanted to do is kind of give you the floor to talk about. I mean, you've touched on a number of things that TeachAids specifically have done, but in your travels and the research that Dr. Sokar has done, and what you guys have done with Scott and his folks in coming to the next steps, as it were, that you want to take teach aids to in terms of the education. What other programs and or references have you come across, or do you use regularly, do you recommend or collaborate with, that folks could reach out to or look up on the internet as a resource if they suspect that their child, or themselves for that matter, may be concussed?
Sure. Well, first of all, just following through with Teach AIDS, www.teachaids.org. If you go there, our name is our product name is Crash Course, and we've talked a lot about VR, but it's very easy to simply download to go to the site Crash Course Football, and you can play it there. It's free. You can show it to anybody. You just can't charge for it, but it's there for anybody, any parent, any child, any coach to look at, and it's a nice resource. So that's simple. It's easy. You can find it on the website and just play the 12-minute video right there. We will have linked to that or adjacent to it very shortly, the brain fly through, which has been interesting. But we're not the only ones working on this. There are a lot of organizations. The CDC, their Heads Up program is really good. Actually, it's a different format than ours. But we teach their lessons that they've spent all this time developing. A lot of different clinics are good. The Mayo Clinic is a great example. Many concussion clinics throughout the country, working closely with one in North Carolina that Josh Bloom, the medical advisor for USA Baseball, runs. In our area, one hit away, Darren DeSavada, I think you know Baca, you know him, nice fellow, do a great job, he and his wife. I've mentioned Mom's Team, Pink Concussions, National Council of Youth Sports, Wayne Moss. Everyone's really concerned about this. The NCAA is very concerned about it. We have to make our sport safer for the athlete. Aspen Institute, Love Your Brain, Concussion Legacy Foundation. There are a lot of different organizations working in this. If you go to the website, you can see what they do, what they have to offer. I just think it's really nice to see people so vested in this and realizing it's such a great problem, and there are resources out there. And hopefully we'll get better and better. And I urge parents of any child, whether in sport or not, to at least go visit one of these and maybe teachaids.org and look at the video for 12 minutes. It's engaging. Your child would like it, or these other organizations, and learn what you can about concussions, so that if your child falls off a bike or off a skateboard or rollerblades, or falls down to the back of the head and running and playing in the playground, or falls off a swing, that they can judge better what this might be and get them help accordingly.
Well, I absolutely agree, and I can tell you that I've already made adjustments to the curriculum that for the workshops that I'm teaching. My in-person workshops are set up to go for 3 hours, and we're working on doing some virtual workshops that are shorter in duration, not quite as complete. But there is just such a tremendous amount of information out there that, and what's amazing is, I think people see things like, whether it's a live stream or a podcast or webinar or a TV show, and they see these organizations being referenced and the people that represent them. And what they don't realize is oftentimes how accessible those organizations are. Not necessarily that, people are going to pick up the phone and call Scott Anderson or Dick Gould, but that they can go to the website, that they can send information and get a response. And there is, all you have to do is ask. There is so much accessibility available now on so many different fronts. So basically, if they have a device and a connection to the internet, they can get a first step of assistance in terms of diagnosing or getting assistance with diagnosis, not diagnosing, but getting assistance with a diagnosis. I just wanted to say thank you very much to Scott Anderson and to Coach Dick Gould for being here with us tonight. I know that we talk a lot about in a metaphorical sense for the good of the game, but I don't know that there are too many things that cross over into all sports, not just out of football into something else, but all sports, in terms of what the research that these gentlemen and their organization are doing, and other organizations like them, to make the world and the game, whatever that game may be, safer for athletes of all ages. And I think that that's extremely important. So Dick and Scott, thank you very much for joining us tonight. I really appreciate you guys taking the time out of your busy day up in the great Northwest to spend a little time with us here.
Great pleasure,
Thanks for
John.
having us,
Thanks.
John. Appreciate it.
Great work. We'll
All right,
catch up
folks,
with you down in Kentucky one of these days.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I'll let you know once my knee heals up when I'm ready to do my time 40 for the combine. So I'll be good to go. So
So you can fix the knee.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, that one's easy. That one's
Can't
easy.
replace the brain.
That's it. Well, listen, folks, I want to go ahead and wrap this up. I appreciate it. We're going to have some additional discussions, and I will, as I said, and Dick, what I'll do is I'll reach out after this via email. And I want to be able to ensure that whatever I incorporate is appropriately represented, and then also making available the information, not only on the website, but anything else that I can help spread the word for you guys. Really appreciate it. So once again, for all our folks out there, if you haven't done so, please go to YouTube and subscribe to the podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. And don't forget, if you're out there doing something for the game of football, remember, do it for the good of the game. Take care and God bless. See you guys.
Thanks, John.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, I'm still here. I'm just waiting to cut off the web stream as well.
Okay. Well, I just sent you a text, man. That was that show was
I got
really
out of your
good.
hair, guys.